Hello and welcome to this video on why it is so hard to get the history of fossils right with the simple yet mind-boggling example of the Magdeburg unicorn. If you look at this image, your first thought is likely to be something along the lines of, what the hell is that? Is it a joke? Or simply confusion? The people who first found this fossil didn't quite have the same thoughts. In fact, they were sure it was the remains of a unicorn. Of course, it does not tell us which cuts of the unicorn meat are the most delicious, but at least it does tell us something about its structure. Jokes aside, it is a fossil from about 1663, or roughly 400 years ago. Well before we had any idea about fossils in any proper detail, or a well-established system to catalogue them. In fact, even in the 1800s and going into the 1900s, we still had issues with this. If nothing else better demonstrates it, there is the platypus. British biologists and scientists refused to accept it as a real animal. They were adamant that it was just a duckbill put onto a beaver, which, looking at it, kind of makes sense. It took a very long time to get them to confirm it as a new species. Admittedly, the challenges with it were not quite the same challenges as, say, with the giant tortoises of the Galapagos Islands, but that's mostly because the giant tortoise is supposedly exceptionally delicious and therefore never made the trip back home. This does bring us to what the Magdeburg unicorn is. The unicorn is essentially an assembly of different animal parts in different ways, and unfortunately this means that the attempt to create a unicorn is basically one great big mess. Parts of it are essentially a woolly mammoth, a woolly rhinoceros. The exact creature's not yet been well established. And the reason they found it, well, they were fairly common in parts of Europe way back in time. Admittedly, last ice age, so when we say way back in time, we mean way back in time. The actual animal itself was really only properly described in the latter part of the 18th century, so roughly 1770 or thereabouts. That would be roughly 100 years after this unicorn was found. So you can pretty much guarantee that they had no idea what they were looking at when they first found it. Now, that's not the only issue with this. Obviously, you have the bizarre structure, but it's the horn that is perhaps the most striking feature. You could arguably consider the rest of it to be a very poorly assembled, say, dinosaur fossil, but that horn, that is unique, and there are different theories as to how, what, and why it is. The first is that it's a tusk from a narwhal, essentially a giant fish with a huge horn on its head. Now, these are still alive today, and for the most part, they're fairly obvious what they are. It's really hard to misidentify them. But if you only have the horn, and the remains of another animal, you may not recognize that they are two separate animals. The horn itself is a long, twisted structure and can grow up to 3 meters, if not more again. The key thing, however, is that it doesn't really match with what we're seeing here, but then again, neither do some of the other fossil remains. For example, the skull looks like a woolly rhinoceros, and the shoulder blades that you see look like they should come from a woolly mammoth. This means we now have at least 2 different animals that have been assembled, and arguably 3, if, and there's a big if to this, the horn is actually from a narwhal. The Magdeburg unicorn is basically one of the worst fossil reconstructions in history, and it's a rather notorious title. Something that, admittedly, it deserves, but for very different reasons than you might initially think. The reason we have so much trouble with it, and why it demonstrates some of the issues around fossils and identifying species, particularly further back in history, is that the assemblage isn't known if the current depiction existed first, or if, for some reason, they relied on a artistic rendering of it and then assembled it to the artistic rendering, or sketch more accurately, but still. And the reason for this is that there was a, let's say, attempt to show what it should look like in reality from an artist. The same sort of thing we get today with artist impressions. But this came before the actual skeleton was assembled, and therefore the artist really was just guessing as to what they thought might be the case, and possibly on various drugs at the time, or very strong alcohol, meaning what they thought could have been influenced by all sorts of exciting and interesting, let's say, narcotics. Of course, it's not for nothing. The actual assembly of this fossilized abomination really only occurred well after the actual artists made their work, and so they were trying to build on what they thought had been there. Realistically, they were more or less assembling it with instructions that may not have even belonged to the same thing. And it's because the individual who did this was a person named Gurik, more accurately von Gurik, and they were trying to, well, to be blunt about this, recreate what they thought had been made after the fact. So now not only do we have one individual who's created a weird artistic impression, we've got a huge time frame between that impression and the assembly, and then we've got a second person now trying to build what they think the first person was showing them. It's a game of Chinese whispers spread over 100 years. Of course, if life was all peaches and cream, you would simply go to the original source and say, what is this and how does it work? Unfortunately, that wasn't possible. Beyond the fact that living to 100 at that time would have been a miracle, the actual content wasn't available, except that the book was published posthumously. That means the guy had been dead for a time and somebody found his notes and went, you know what, this will sell really well, let's put it into a book. That is the first major issue, but there's another problem, and arguably this problem is even more significant, and it would probably give archaeologists, anthropologists, and paleontologists an absolute fit. The skeleton, when it was being removed from the cave in which it was found, was more or less broken up into parts. Yeah, they destroyed parts of the skeleton during the removal or collection of them. Unfortunately, that means you don't know what is what anymore. And yeah. Of course, we then have the fact that, well, this is the 1600s, or late 1600s, but still, essentially the either late medieval period or early Renaissance, and you have what is essentially a fossil. Naturally, the people who dug it up took it to a local abbey, and the abbess, the individual who ran the convent, or nunnery if you will, essentially was given these things and said, hey look, we found this awesome stuff, can you tell us what it is? And they gave them a variety of broken bones, a horn, the skull, some ribs and a few other things, and said, can you tell us what this is? From a religious figure. Obviously, at this time, they probably were more educated, but more educated than a time where education was terrible is still not well educated. And so, we end up with this incredibly bad example of taxidermy and skeletal reconstruction. It's a hilarious thing to look at, and every now and then you'll see it come up on the internet as a meme or something similar. But it is more or less just a lack of information, a lack of skill, and a lack of, well, just ability in the end. The other thing to note here is that what you see in just about every image, if not every image, is not actually the original. What you see more or less every time is a reconstruction, mostly made out of plastic and ceramics, produced in the 1990s by the taxidermist Urs Oberli. And so we're not actually looking at the original anyway, and that does raise other concerns given we know that the original was very damaged when they first created this thing, and as such, what they've built, their model that they're now relying on, may not even be an accurate reflection of what the original model was meant to be, which wasn't even well prepared in the first place. And of course, it's not the only example of weird species issues. Admittedly, this is one of the better, if only because it's reasonably well documented, and we can see very obviously what the problem is. But we do have these same sort of concerns even today with species that are currently existing. For example, the orca, or as it is also known, the killer whale, is not a whale. It's more akin to a shark or a dolphin, and this was only clearly identified after genetic sequencing. Rhododendrons and azaleas have long been argued over, and there are other species again. This is why, despite being relatively technologically advanced, having a wide body of knowledge and a great deal of depth to that knowledge, we still have to rely on things like phylogenetics, phylogeny, anatomy, physiology, and more to describe relationships between specimens, variants, species, and more, or even to figure out if something like this could have vaguely, possibly, maybe existed sometime way back when, or in this instance, the last ice age. But it's one of many different exciting and interesting species that Well, in this instance, we have a fairly comprehensive set of remains, but for others, we may only have a small selection and we have to figure out what fills in those gaps. For some people, they decide that that gap can be filled very simply with the, gap filler called God. In other cases, they decide, let's work around it or build bridges over it to better figure out later on, based on further knowledge, if we can put something in there. It's kind of like puzzle pieces, in a very vague sense, except in this case, the puzzle they assembled was made out of 6 different puzzles, and none of them are very similar. Except it looks cool, in a weird way. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.